It is wet here. It is swampland. And the Shawshannock people lived right near here, right on the other side of here, right beyond where they're doing some road construction right now, in the area known as Shawshannock. Where do they go? Tonight, part 2, King Philip's War. Swansea had been destroyed. Lancaster, Medway, Brookfield had been destroyed. Now Springfield. Springfield was a real disaster for everyone. Springfield had had very friendly relationships with the Indians. If Springfield was not safe, there was no place that was safe, and there was no one who could be trusted. As was written at the time, all Indians now, friend or foe alike, were considered, quote, the children of the devil, full of all subtlety and malice, unquote. And for the praying Indians, this was a real disaster. The English didn't know who they could trust, who they couldn't. More than that, the English also took part in looting and worse, until many of the Indians joined in the hostility, including those who had been faithful to the colonists, who had actually been scouting for the militia. They too decided they'd had enough, and they too joined with Philip. It was ordered by the General Court that no Indian from praying towns be received in any other town, only at the local jails. Finally, the praying Indians were removed to Deer Island in Boston Harbor. Their provisions were meager and the suffering great. Hundreds died over the winter. The authorities had to disband mobs who wanted to get into boats, go out in the harbor and finish the job. And oddly enough, at the same time, a group of praying Indians, including a 17-year-old boy known as James the Printer, who we'll meet again in a little while, were taken prisoner by the Nipmuc Confederation. Again, the praying Indians were between a rock and a hard place. Also, that November, the English pondered the question of the Narragansett Indians. They professed to be neutral, and for the most part they were, but things were really getting dicey. The English didn't think they could take any chances. The fear and paranoia of the English was tremendous. Another large tribe joining the hostility would be a disaster on top of a disaster. And so plans were made for a preemptive strike. Benjamin Church led the expedition against the Narragansett people. If you read the history books, you'd get the impression that Church led all the expeditions of the English. You'd think this because Benjamin Church wrote his biography, and others such as Josiah Winslow and Samuel Mosley did not. The attack on the Narragansett Indians happened at a place called the Great Swamp. It's a hell of a fight, hell of an English victory. Mosley is on the front lines, although from reading Church's biography you wouldn't know that. Led by an Indian guide on December 16, 1675, on a bitterly cold, storm-filled day, the colonial force found the main Narragansett fort near modern South Kingston, Rhode Island. Crossing the frozen swamp, a combined force of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Connecticut militia, numbering about 1,000 men, including 150 Pequods and Mohegans, attacked the fort. The bitter and hard-fought battle that followed is known as the Great Swamp Fight. It's believed that about 300 Native Americans were killed. Exact figures are unavailable. The massive fort, occupying over 5 acres of land, was burned, and most of the tribe's winter stores were destroyed. Many of the warriors and their families escaped into the frozen swamp. Facing a winter with little food and shelter, the entire surviving Narragansett tribe was forced out of quasi-neutrality and joined the fight. The colonists lost many of their officers in the assault. About 70 of their men were killed and nearly 150 more wounded. This fight is of local interest. The Narragansett Indians had counted on the swamp being a natural barrier as well as their palisade of logs around the fort itself. They had one way of approaching the fort, and that was across a log, which came across, again, a natural water barrier. The reason the English were able to attack so successfully was because the water was frozen. Still, a lot of the attack came across this log, and many of the officers of the colonists were lost crossing that log, including a man named John Wyman Jr., son of John Wyman, nephew of Francis Wyman. Francis, his son Francis Jr., and John Sr. also took part in this fight. We'll get back to them a little later. However, it was no longer a question of who the Narragansetts would fight with. They were with King Philip. The heavy-handed tactics of the English and Philip's eloquence brought more and more Indians into the fight against the English. As 1676 dawns, there are many, many more battles, including Andover, Chelmsford, and Groton. In Medfield, as in many of the small towns, the settlers, in their greed for land, had taken more than they could possibly cultivate, and large tracts from which the timber had been cut had been allowed to grow up so the houses seemed as if they were seated in the midst of heaps of bushes. During the night of February 21st, the Indians, under One-Eyed John, stealing upon the town, hid themselves in this brush, behind the orchard walls, under the sides of barns and outhouses, in the midst of the settlement itself. Samuel Morse saw an Indian hiding in the hay. He affected ignorance of the intruder's presence, but left the barn immediately, and gathering his family, fled to the garrison, his house and barn bursting into flames behind him. Then from all sides came the shots, the yelling of Indians, and the cries of the alarmed settlers. Many of the houses were burning, and soldiers and settlers coming to the doors were shot down on the threshold. 18 persons in all were killed, others were taken away alive, and an old man of near 100 was burned to death in his home. Soon 40 or 50 houses were in flames, but the greater part of the troops and settlers had now reached the garrison house, and the cannon of the garrison was roaring the signal of the attack to the people of Dedham. Before the soldiers in the town could rally, the Indians had drawn off across the river to a neighboring hill, burning the bridge behind them, and were roasting an ox in full view of the smoking ruins. The soldiers halted at the bridge, where the following notice met their eyes. Know by this paper that the Indians thou hast provoked to wrath and anger will war this 21 years, if you will. There are many Indians yet. We come 300 at this time. You must consider the Indians lose nothing but their life. You must lose your fair houses and cattle. It was later learned that handbill was printed by James the Printer, who had been taken by the Nipmucks that previous fall. Many believed this proof of the praying Indians' treachery. Also at this time was the raid on Lancaster and the capture of Mary Rowlandson. While her husband was away in Boston trying to convince the colony's leaders to provide military protection for the town, the Indians attacked on February 10th, 1676. Mary was captured along with her 3 children, one of whom, her 6-year-old daughter Sarah, was mortally wounded during the surrender. The captives were taken west and north to what is now southwestern New Hampshire and Vermont. Later, Mary was brought back to the Mount Wachusett area of Massachusetts, where she was redeemed by the brave John Hoare, a resident of Concord. 6 years later, in 1682, she published a narrative of her captivity, which became America's first bestseller. At that time, it was highly unusual for a woman to be a published author. Hers is a story of the triumph of faith over adversity, and it provides a first-hand description of Indian life during this conflict. Mary was not the first colonist taken captive, nor, of course, the last, but hers is perhaps the most interesting story to tell, simply because she lived to tell it, not only to tell it, but to write a book about it. I can't say for sure, but I believe it's possible that it's Mary's story which became the foundation of the popular image of the white captive of the savage Indian. I put the word savage into quotations because the story Mary tells takes place in a world as foreign to us as the surface of Mars. She tells how, as Lancaster was being taken and prisoners rounded up, the men of fighting age and small children who could not travel were, as she puts it, knocked on the head and killed. It should be pointed out that this was common treatment of the Indians in villages captured by the colonists. This was a time of capital punishment, even for minor crimes. Each of us can decide who, in fact, was savage. Mary tells us that neither she nor any of the other women were sexually assaulted. This just didn't happen. This isn't to say that prisoners were treated gently. They weren't. They were treated as well as any of the Indians on the march. The Indians would share their food and what they had, meager as it may be, and that lack of food will become very important very shortly. However, the prisoners were not treated gently. In fact, Mary tells us the fate of a woman and her daughter when that woman decided she just couldn't go on. I'll spare you the details. Let's just say that the Indians might quickly kill a woman, but they would not take her virtue. Food was lacking, as was medicine, nor time for the treatment of the wounded, as Mrs. Rawlinson was wounded as well as her 6-year-old daughter, Sarah, both struck by the same bullet during the siege. 9 days later, Sarah died of her wounds. The next morning, the Indians buried her at the top of a nearby hill. Mary has an interesting story. She tells of the return of the warriors from their raid on Medfield, tells how a large group of men, women, and children were able to keep ahead of the English soldiers hunting them. No one can be absolutely sure of the route of their travels, but this map is the best approximation that's been made. That spring, the tide turns. And Philip was becoming almost irrelevant to the war he'd started. He was sick and on the run. The Nipmuc and Narragansett warriors were carrying on the fight, while Philip was traveling north and west to try to get the Mohawks to join the cause. Increase Mather writes that in a desperate effort to inflame the Mohawks, Philip and his men killed a few from a hunting party they encountered, then blamed the murder on the English. He didn't know that one of his would-be victims had lived and escaped to tell of the treachery. The Mohawks were now his bitter foes. In late February, they attacked Philip. In March, the Mohawks returned in triumph to Albany with many scalps and prisoners as proof of their triumph. Meanwhile, Philip traveled east towards the Connecticut River. His was now a reputation of hollow words and defeat in battle. The sachems of the other tribes spoke openly about delivering Philip's head to the English in exchange for peace. The war was not over by any means, however, and a few major battles were left to be fought. In March of 1676, Plymouth Plantation was attacked. The attack was driven off, but the ability of the Indians to mount an offensive deep in colonial territory was obvious to one and all. The colonial fear was very real. Boston had already debated the idea of erecting a wall around the entire city as communities within 10 miles of the colonial capital had been attacked. That includes this area here. Right across in Billerica, this part of Woburn, we now call Burlington, was garrisoned. In an attempt to ward off the continued attacks in Rhode Island, Captain Michael Pierce led a force of 80 men, 60 colonial warriors, and 20 Wampanoag Christian Indians in pursuit of the Narragansett warriors. These troops were ambushed in an area now known as Central Falls, Rhode Island. There were few survivors, and the Narragansetts only lost a handful of their warriors. 9 of the survivors were tortured to death at a site in what is now Cumberland, Rhode Island. The site is now known as Nine Man's Misery. 3 days later, Providence was utterly destroyed. This would be the last great victory for the Narragansetts. In April, they were defeated near the mouth of the Blackstone River, and their sachem, Canachet, was captured and executed. But the war went on. In April, Sudbury was attacked. In May, Hatfield. Also in May, the English attacked a camp of sleeping Indians near Deerfield, and Mary Rowlandson was released and reunited with her family in Boston. Later that same month, the Praying Indians were finally released from Deer Island and moved to Cambridge. Militarily, however, the most important event would happen near the falls on the Connecticut River at a place called Kenepscot. Captain William Turner, along with Captain Holyoke, led a force of about 150 militia in an attack on a large fishing camp. The attack came at dawn, the surprise was complete, and upwards of 200 of the Indians were killed with a little loss to Turner's force. Many of the Indians, it is claimed, jumped into the river to escape the attack and were swept over the falls. Turner, however, had made no plans to secure his line of retreat, and he too was attacked after the initial battle, as other nearby bands of Indians who'd heard the musket fire rallied to join the fight. Turner and as many as 40 of his men were killed. The area of the battle is now known as Turner's Falls, and the battle is referred to as the Turner's Falls Massacre. The town of Hadley was attacked in June, but Connecticut soldiers repulsed the attack. Also in June, Massachusetts issued a declaration of amnesty for any Indian who surrendered. The war now entered a phase which modern military would characterize as mopping up. However, any modern soldier would tell you that a mopping up campaign can be just as deadly as a head-on assault. In the book Mayflower, Nathaniel Philbrick tells us that the Nipmuc leader Sagamore Sam, who it is claimed helped found the praying village of Shoshonak here in Burlington, lost his life during English assault on June 9. I've seen other accounts where it said that Sagamore Sam was captured and hanged on the Boston Common later that September. Whatever the truth of the matter, the Nipmuc Indians now sued for peace. Large groups of colonial militia from Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Plymouth colonies began sweeping the region and rounding up all the Indians they could find. Many of the prisoners who were shown to have attacked the English were executed. Many more were shipped off as slaves to the Caribbean. King Philip and his band were now truly alone. They had camped at the foot of Mount Wachusett since the beginning of winter, but this place, which had now seemed a sanctuary, was now a trap. The colonial militia and their Indian allies and those tribes once loyal to Philip, but now starving and under increasing pressure to end the war, were all looking for him. Philip began his last desperate retreat to Mount Hope. It's at this point that Benjamin Church truly becomes a notable figure of American history. The colonists had come to rely more and more on the Mohawk, Mohegan, and other Indian allies. Even Samuel Mosley had begun using praying Indians as scouts. But it was Church who used Indians to the greatest extent, not only as scouts, but as the greater part of his main force. Church had learned not to let his men march in a large group, but spread out. This made his force look bigger than it was and very difficult to ambush. They learned never to exit a swamp the same way they'd entered. They learned to move silently. Church's tactics and his comparatively lenient treatment of prisoners enhanced his reputation among the Indians as well as the colonists. He was soon bringing in far more prisoners than other military organizations. It's almost impossible to exaggerate the desperate condition that Philip and his people found themselves in. The swamps, which had once been their refuge and their protection, were no longer safe. The most terrible thing I read was the report that many of the children of the group were being killed by their own tribe. They could not be protected, they could not be fed, and their cries for hunger could easily lead the enemy to the tribe. Even this sacrifice was not enough. Reports came in of warriors so terrified by their sudden confrontations with colonial militia and their Indian allies that they were shot down with loaded muskets in their hands, unable to discharge them, or if so, ineffectively. Others simply threw down their firearms and surrendered. There was just no more reason to fight. Philip himself escaped death twice, once jumping into the bush just as his uncle was shot down next to him. The hunt for Philip and his group continued systematically. By the beginning of August, only Philip and a few of his hardcore followers remained. Benjamin Church, leading a band of mostly Sakonnet Indians, with a deserter from Philip's band as a scout, tracked Philip down to a swamp near Mount Hope. Philip had killed the deserter's brother, and the man was seeking revenge. It was known that during battle, Philip would be the first to run and quickly flee the area. Whether this was a sign of cowardice or his belief that he was irreplaceable to the war, I don't know. But that knowledge was used to set a trap. Philip's camp was located and silently surrounded. two men, Caleb Cook and a Pocasset Indian named Alderman, placed themselves along Philip's likely route of escape. As the battle began, as expected, Philip ran away from the fight, straight towards Cook and Alderman. They raised their muskets and fired. Cook's musket misfired, but Alderman hit his mark. King Philip, successor to Massasoit, a man whose name had once been a nightmare to the colonists of New England, lay dead, half naked, face down in the mud. His body was taken to Plymouth, where it was subjected to the punishment of English traitors. He was drawn and quartered, his head cut off and put on display, where it would remain for the next 20 years. One of his hands was given to Alderman as a reward. He put it in a bottle of rum and used it as an exhibit from which he made, quote, many a penny, unquote, during the following years. Philip's wife and son were captured shortly afterwards. They were shipped off to Bermuda. There were a few more incidents of note. In Cocheco, now Dover, New Hampshire, a remarkable battle was held. This battle was witnessed by William Butters of that part of Woburn now known as Wilmington. What happened was that hostile Indians from the Massachusetts colony had fled north and mixed in with those who were friendly towards the English. Some companies of the Massachusetts militia came to take the hostiles back for trial. The problem was that even the local English could not easily tell friend from foe among the Indians. It was feared that if taken by force, a battle would ensue which could easily still be another massacre. Major Waldron of the local New Hampshire militia came up with a plan by which the Indians could be sorted out without loss of life. Major William Waldron of Dover planned a sham battle with the friendly Indians of the vicinity, and after the Indians had emptied their guns in good faith, they were seized by Captain Sill and his company. 300 Indians were taken to Boston, where 6 were hanged on the Boston Common. The remainder were sent to the Bermudas and sold as slaves. The idea was the sham battle would happen as everybody just fired their guns in the air, and then they could go home and say, oh, what a terrible battle it was. By previous arrangement, the Indians fired their guns in good faith, but a musket only has one shot. Once they'd fired, they were now effectively disarmed. They were surrounded by the militia, who then just lowered their weapons and said, you're now our prisoners. Just as the plague of 1618 was not the first wave of illness to go through the Indians, nor would it be the last. King Philip's War was not the first war between the Indians and Europeans, not even the first in New England. There would be other smaller conflicts in the region, King William's War, King George's War, and other unnamed conflicts. But this time would be remembered and sometimes used as a rallying point. The Shawnee chief Tecumseh said, where today are the Pequod, where today are the Narragansett, the Mohegan, the Pokanoket, and many other once powerful tribes of our people. They have vanished before the avarice and oppression of the white man as snow before a summer sun. Two civilizations cannot exist, one on top of the other, and the wars for dominance would continue for another 220 years. These conflicts would finally end in what was known as the Great Indian Wars of the Plains at a place called Wounded Knee. No, it was not the first nor the last, but on a per capita basis, it was the bloodiest war in American history. During World War II, the United States lost about 1% of the adult male population killed in war. During the Civil War, about 4%. Let me add a local detail. I'd mentioned earlier that John Wyman Jr. had been killed in the Great Swamp Fight. His cousin, Francis Wyman Jr., was wounded, and he later died of his wounds. Uncle Francis Wyman was also wounded, seriously enough so that he retired back to Woburn proper and never farmed the area down the street from this building again. That's a 75% casualty rate. That was not uncommon among the militia. During the 14 months of King Philip's War, the Plymouth colony lost over 8% of the adult male population. If you were to extrapolate that number to the present population of the United States, it would be about 8 million dead. And that's just among the adult male population. That doesn't count the women and children slaughtered. That doesn't count the 50% of the communities attacked, the 10% utterly destroyed, the fledgling industries wiped out, the farmland lay fallow. And this was among the English settlers. And they won the war. Among the Indians, the losses were much, much worse. Many of the praying Indian towns were dismantled and their people driven out of the area. Among the hostile tribes, the best way to describe their loss was not to say they'd been decimated, but annihilated. Any hostile warrior who was seen to have taken up arms was hanged. Many of the non-combatants, women and children, were sold into the slow death of the Caribbean sugar plantations. And the Indians, too, could be unforgiven. 13 years after the sham battle in Dover, there was revenge. Major Waldron was captured and tortured to death. His treachery during King Philip's War was not the only reason he was killed. His family taken prisoner, others of the community killed, and the town burned to the ground. But it was a start. It's difficult for us to understand the people who took part in this drama. Their hatred for each other and savagery towards each other was of a scale that beggars the imagination. This can be explained in part by the fact that these were people of two utterly different worlds who may have had trouble thinking of each other as human beings. Increase Mather was speaking for the colonists, but we can well imagine he also summed up the feelings of the Indians when he said, "We should not be surprised that the colonists, often hard-pressed to win these all-out assaults, developed not only a fear of the Indians, but a hatred as well. Treating with the Indians as equals or even pseudo-equals was quite beyond their comprehension, or in most cases, their abilities. They were simply incapable of thinking of each other as equals." John Goff points out that we'd be foolish to think that over the span of 400 years, we can possibly understand a people who lived here for thousands of years, who had no written language, left behind few artifacts. Their villages would have been of wood, bark, of animal hide. It all would have rotted away centuries ago. I don't know what to look for. Arrowheads, perhaps? I wouldn't know an arrowhead from a chipped piece of rock. John Goff perhaps might. This is all marshy area, swampland really, nowadays called wetlands. Anything that was here has been swallowed up a long time ago. Including that mystery. Where did they go? The Shawshannock people of the Nipmuc Confederation of the Algonquin Nation. The answer is, I don't know. The records just aren't there. We don't know how many took part in King Philip's War. If so, how many casualties there were. How many may have been taken prisoner and shipped off to that slow death of slavery in the Caribbean sugar plantations. How many simply faded back into the forest, into the northern part of New England, perhaps became part of the Abenaki League. We don't know. So many questions we don't know. But it's worth thinking about. King Philip's War, I was tempted to think of it as birth pains of New England, or perhaps a growing pain, but that is really very trite when you consider the pain of the people who suffered it. It is part of history. History is not always pleasant. History can be downright painful. But history is what it is. We should face it. We should know that it exists, what the story really is. King Philip's War is a large part of what makes New England what it is today. And it should not be forgotten. Till next time, I'm Mike Trito.